Think about the last time you tried to learn a new language.
Oh, yeah.
If you are like most people, joining us today, you probably downloaded an app.
Right.
You spent a few weeks just swiping through those vocabulary flashcards.
Yeah, the spaced repetition stuff.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
you practice saying things like, "Where's the library?"
Yeah.
Or, "I would like a coffee, please."
The essentials.
Right. But there is this underlying assumption we all have when we approach language today. We basically view it as a utility. It is a tool. You memorize the conjugations, you figure out the grammar rules, and the ultimate goal is just the functional exchange of information.
Yeah.
It is a bridge between you and another person.
That is the very modern, highly pragmatic view of it.
Right.
We treat language as a completely neutral vehicle. You load your thoughts into the vehicle, drive it across the bridge, and unpack it on the other side.
Exactly. But I want you, the listener, joining us today on this deep dive, to just set aside that modern assumption for a minute.
Yeah.
Because I want you to imagine stepping into a language that isn't just a bridge.
Right.
Imagine a language that does not just allow you to speak, but actually dictates the very architecture of your thoughts.
It's a huge shift.
It really is. A language that feels less like a neutral tool and, honestly, much more like a civilizational operating system.
Yeah.
Imagine thinking in stone, like in load-bearing beams and monumental columns.
It is the absolute definition of linguistic architecture.
Yeah.
In this kind of language, you are not just communicating, you are literally building.
Right.
You are arranging reality into a strict hierarchy.
And that is exactly what we are exploring in today's deep dive. We are looking at this truly fascinating body of research that approaches the Latin language not as a dead tongue,
Right, not at all.
but through a very specific psychological lens.
Yeah.
The framework we have in our source material categorizes human drives into different archetypes or sub-personalities.
Which is such an interesting way to look at it.
Totally. And in this framework, Latin is the ultimate expression of a sub-personality named Val.
And just to clarify for the listener, Val isn't a historical figure.
Right. Good point.
Val is a conceptual shorthand. It represents a very specific, deeply ingrained human psychological drive.
The drive for discipline.
Exactly. Discipline, law, military organization, and enduring institutional legacy. Val is the part of the human psyche that basically wants to build things that will survive the collapse of civilization.
It's the builder,
Yeah.
the general, the lawmaker.
Yes.
And our mission today is to figure out how that specific psychological drive manifested in an actual language.
Right.
So we are not here to drill you on declensions.
There's verb charts today.
No dusty verb charts. The goal is to climb inside the machinery of Latin. We want to see how this language literally shaped human thought,
It's cute.
how it dictated the structure of Western civilization, and how it eventually shattered into this massive dialect cloud that birthed the modern languages millions of people speak today.
It is a remarkable historical phenomenon, honestly. You are talking about a journey from a tiny, incredibly localized dialect.
Spoken by just a few thousand farmers, right?
Exactly. To a global conceptual framework that still governs how we think about law, science, and power today.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the beginning.
Let's do it.
Because when you look at the historical record, this is the part that is genuinely staggering to me.
Yeah.
How does a highly localized, completely practical, somewhat rough dialect from a swampy area in central Italy and end up conquering the conceptual framework of the entire Western world?
Right.
I mean, at its inception, Latin wasn't really special, was it?
Not at all. I mean, if you were an observer of the ancient Mediterranean around, say, 700 BCE, you would never have placed your bets on Latin.
Really?
Oh, absolutely not. Latin began in Latium, which is a relatively small region on the western coast of central Italy.
Right around what would eventually become Rome.
Right. And at that time, it was just one of several Italic languages. It's part of the massive Indo-European language family.
Which means it's related to a ton of others.
Exactly. It shares deep, very distant ancestral roots with languages as diverse as Greek, Sanskrit, the Celtic languages, and even Germanic languages.
Okay, so it's a cousin to all these other languages, but it's surrounded by much more sophisticated cultures at the time.
Oh, definitely.
You had the Etruscans to the north, right? Then there were master engineers and artists.
Yes.
You had the Greeks to the south, who were already building these magnificent colonies, writing philosophy, composing epic poetry.
And right in the middle, you have these Latin speakers.
Yeah, what were they doing?
Well, early Latin was basically the language of subsistence farmers and herdsmen.
Just trying to survive.
Exactly. It was an agrarian, deeply pragmatic dialect. What changed everything, and I mean the sole catalyst for its global dominance, was the political entity of Rome itself.
The state.
Right. As Rome expanded, first from a struggling city-state fighting off its neighbors to a sprawling republic and finally into a massive intercontinental empire, Latin just rode the wave of that expansion.
Right.
And there is a crucial fundamental point from our source material we have to establish right away.
Okay.
Latin did not spread across Europe and North Africa because the people conquered by Rome thought it was a beautiful language.
It wasn't poetry that won the day.
No, and it certainly didn't spread because it was easy to learn.
Yeah, anyone who took high school Latin knows that.
Right. It is fiercely complex. It spread for one reason only. It was inextricably tied to the survival mechanisms of the Roman state.
Wow.
Latin became the language of military command. It was the language of imperial administration, of taxation, of the engineering required for road building.
The legal system.
The legal system, absolutely. And eventually, the ultimate prize Roman citizenship itself.
You know, it makes me think of a modern technological analogy.
Oh,
Think about something like TCP/IP,
okay.
the foundational protocol of the internet, or even just a standard USB port.
Oh, I like this.
Right, because USB wasn't adopted by every computer manufacturer on Earth, because it was the most elegant, perfectly beautiful, aesthetically pleasing piece of engineering ever conceived.
We all remember trying to plug it in the wrong way 3 times.
Exactly, it had flaws.
Yeah.
But it was adopted because if you wanted to plug into the network of modern power, if you wanted to transfer data, if you wanted to participate in the global digital economy,
You had to use it.
you had to use it. Latin was the Roman USB port.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. You had to plug into the network of power.
Right.
If you were a Gaul or a Briton or an Iberian and you wanted to trade safely across the Mediterranean, you needed Latin.
Makes sense.
If you wanted to appeal to a judge for the protection of your property under Roman law, you needed Latin.
Yeah.
If you wanted to advance in society or survive in the auxiliary military legions, you just had to plug in.
And because that network lasted for centuries and spanned thousands of miles, the language obviously couldn't stay static.
No, it had to evolve.
It had to meet the demands of this massive infrastructure. And I think when people today think of Latin, they tend to have a very monolithic view of it.
Oh, absolutely.
They picture a Roman soldier shivering on Hadrian's Wall in Britain, speaking the exact same pristine, polished sentences as Cicero standing in the Senate in Rome.
Which is a massive historical misconception. Latin is not one single thing. To understand how the vowel archetype of discipline and structure evolved, we have to look at the distinct historical phases of the language.
I'll take those down.
So the earliest phase is Old Latin.
Okay.
This is the rough, unpolished language of the early republic. You find it in fragmented ancient inscriptions, early religious formulas.
Like carvings on old temples and stuff.
Exactly. And fragments of archaic law, like the famous 12 tables.
And from what I understand from the text, Old Latin reflects a society that is still deeply paranoid,
Very much so.
still fighting for its life on the Italian peninsula.
Yeah.
It's heavily focused on agriculture, boundaries, basic defense.
Yeah.
It sounds stern. It sounds like tribal memory.
Yes, it is heavily rhythmic, often relying on alliteration rather than strict meter. But as Rome conquered Greece and absorbed Greek education, the Roman elite began to consciously engineer their language.
Ah, they wanted an upgrade.
Exactly. They wanted a language that could rival the sophistication of Greek but retain Roman authority.
Makes sense.
And this gives birth to the phase most people think of, classical Latin.
The prestige form.
Precisely. This is the language of the elite writers. Cicero, Virgil, Ovid, Julius Caesar.
The heavy hitters.
Right. It was highly standardized, balanced, controlled, and intensely architectonic. It was, in many ways, an artificial construct.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was refined specifically for public speaking, for legal arguments, and for epic poetry.
And here is where I really want to push back on the popular imagination.
Okay.
Because that polished, architectonic, perfectly balanced language, that is what people mistakenly think everyone in the Roman Empire spoke.
Right.
We have this Hollywood image of a baker in Pompeii or some blacksmith in Gaul speaking in these perfectly balanced nested clauses.
Yeah.
But that would be utterly exhausting, wouldn't it?
It would be impossible. The ordinary people across the empire simply did not speak like Cicero.
So what did they speak?
Which brings us to the third and, frankly, the most crucial phase for the actual history of human communication: Vulgar Latin.
And we should clarify for the listener, vulgar here doesn't mean swearing or obscenity.
No, no. It comes from the Latin word vulgus, which simply means the common people, the crowd.
Okay.
Vulgar Latin was the everyday speech of the masses.
The street slang.
Exactly. It was the language of the soldiers on the frontier, the merchants haggling in the markets, the laborers.
The enslaved peoples.
Yes, the enslaved peoples, the provincial settlers.
Basically, the people who are actually doing the living and dying in the empire.
Precisely. And unlike the frozen perfection of classical Latin, Vulgar Latin was fluid. It was dynamic.
It was alive.
Right. It dropped complicated word endings. It borrowed heavily from local Celtic or Iberian languages. It simplified the grammar. And what is so fascinating is that it was this living, breathing, gritty street language, not the polished classical Latin of the elite, that eventually birthed every single Romance language we have today.
Wait, really? Every single one?
Yes. Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Romanian, they are all the children of Vulgar Latin, the slang of the Roman streets.
It's actually quite haunting when you think about it.
Oh, so?
We picture Latin as this elite, pristine, marble language. We study it in these pristine textbooks.
True.
But the reality is that the Latin that survived, the Latin that shaped the modern world, was the practical, weathered language of soldiers and traders just trying to get through the day.
It is the ultimate triumph of the practical over the theoretical.
That's beautifully put.
But the story doesn't end when the Western Roman Empire collapses in the 5th century.
Right.
We move into late Latin and eventually medieval or ecclesiastical Latin. The empire fell, the legions vanished, the political structure completely disintegrated.
Total collapse.
But the language didn't die. It essentially underwent a massive corporate restructuring.
It got a career change.
It really did. It became the great trans-regional operating system of medieval Europe. Even though it was no longer the native, spoken language of the common people, who were by now speaking early forms of French or Spanish Latin, remained the absolute monopoly of institutions.
It was the language of diplomacy.
Exactly. If a king in England needed to negotiate with a king in Hungary, their scribes communicated in Latin.
Wow.
It was the language of early science, of universities, and of the law.
And most importantly, it was the language of the Catholic Church,
Absolutely.
which is a massive shift in the psychological weight of the language.
Right.
Because for centuries, Latin was entirely associated with the sword.
Right.
It was the language of civic order, of military conquest, of the brutal subjugation of foreign peoples, of imperial power.
Yes.
And then the Church pivots the entire machinery of the language.
He repurposed it.
They took the vocabulary of the Roman courtroom and the Roman military camp, and they repurposed it to express sin, salvation, grace, confession, and eternity.
It is a profound psychological transformation.
Give me an example of that.
Take a word like sacramentum.
Okay.
Originally, that meant a Roman soldier's oath of allegiance to his commander.
Like a literal military pledge.
Exactly. But it was transformed by the church to mean a holy sacrament, an oath to God.
Oh, wow.
The structure of the language remained the exact same, but the target moved from earthly empire to the kingdom of heaven.
That is fascinating.
Latin became the bridge language connecting ancient pagan Rome, the Christian Middle Ages, and the entire intellectual history of the West.
Okay, so if Latin was the literal software of this massive, centuries-long empire, and later the software of the church, we really need to look at its underlying code.
Let's do it.
Because it's one thing to say Latin is organized, but it's another to see how it mechanically forces your brain to organize reality.
Yeah.
If we want to understand this Val subpersonality, this deep drive for discipline and structure, we have to look at the grammar and the syntax.
Yes.
How did it force its speakers to think differently than we do today?
To understand the cognitive shift required by Latin, we have to contrast it with English.
Okay, our language.
Right. English is what linguists classify as an analytic language.
What does that mean?
That means it relies fundamentally on sequential word order to convey meaning. It is linear.
Right. Subject, then verb, then object. It's a straight line from A to B to C.
Exactly. Take a simple sentence. The girl sees the dog.
Okay.
In English, your brain knows who is doing the seeing and who is being seen entirely based on where the words sit in the sentence.
Because girl comes first.
Exactly. If
Yeah.
you scramble that order and say, the dog sees the girl, you haven't just changed the rhythm, you have completely reversed the meaning of reality.
Right. Now the dog is doing the seeing.
The position of the word is its function, but Latin operates on a completely alien system. It is a highly inflected language. Meaning is not derived primarily from word order.
Wait, really?
Meaning is derived from the endings attached to the words. These are called cases.
Okay, let's play with this, because when I first grasped this from the text, it felt like a magic trick.
It is pretty vague.
Let's translate that sentence. The girl sees the dog. In Latin, girl is puella.
Yes,
Dog is canis, which I know becomes canem when it's the object.
correct.
And sees is videt. So we could say pua canem videt.
Right. Puella has an ending that marks it as the nominative case, the subject, the doer.
Okay.
Canem has an ending that marks it as the accusative case, the direct object, the receiver of the action.
But because those endings are basically locked onto the words, I could totally scramble the sentence.
You could.
I could say canem quella videt, I put the dog first. But it doesn't mean the dog sees the girl. It still means the girl sees the dog.
Exactly.
The meaning is locked into the architecture of the word itself, regardless of its geography in the sentence.
Yes. You could say videt canem puella. You could say puella videt canem. The grammatical function is permanently welded to the noun.
Now, wait a minute. Let me push back on this.
Sure.
Because from an English-speaking perspective, this sounds like a total nightmare.
It does.
If you can just put the words in whatever order you feel like, doesn't that make the language incredibly chaotic?
It's a natural assumption.
I mean, if there are no rules about where the subject or the verb has to go, doesn't every conversation just turn into a giant, confusing word scramble?
Yeah.
How did two people even talk to each other in a noisy marketplace?
Right. It is a completely natural assumption to think that flexible word order equals chaos. But you have to remember the vowel archetype. Vowel does not do chaos.
Discipline.
Exactly. In practice, the Romans did not use this flexibility to scramble their words randomly. They used it to create highly engineered, almost weaponized rhetorical effects.
Weaponized.
Because you aren't bound by a strict subject-verb-object sequence, you can place words exactly where they will have the maximum psychological impact.
Oh, wow.
And this leads us to the crown jewel of Roman thought, the periodic sentence structure.
Yes, the periodic sentence. This is where the engineering really shines in the text and where the language starts to feel like a military formation.
Absolutely. Because the endings lock in the meaning, a Roman orator or historian did not have to give you the verb, the action of the sentence, right away.
Okay.
They could construct a massive paragraph-long sentence and place the main verb at the very, very end.
Just save it.
Right. The information is delivered in a highly specific strategic hierarchy. First, you lay down the context.
Okay.
Then you establish the temporal conditions. Then you introduce the subordinate participants.
And I'm just listening, waiting for the point.
Yes. You as the listener have to hold all of this information in your mind, suspended, waiting. Finally, at the very end of the paragraph, the verb arrives and locks the entire massive structure into place.
Let me try to construct an analogy to show how this feels, because it is so counterintuitive to us.
Go for it.
Imagine reading an account of a battle. An English writer, using our linear analytic structure, would give you the main action immediately.
Right.
They would write, Caesar advanced the army when the enemy had crossed the river, after the scouts reported the movement, and the Senate ordered a response.
Simple. Clear.
You know what happened in the first three words? Caesar advanced. The rest is just details filling in the background.
Right. There is no tension in that English sentence. The mystery is solved immediately.
But in Latin, the structure mirrors the actual temporal sequence of events, and it builds immense psychological tension.
Yes.
It would read more like, when the enemy had crossed the frozen river, after the scouts under cover of darkness reported the movement, and the Senate in Rome ordered an immediate, forceful response. Caesar, his weapons drawn, the army advanced.
Yes. That final verb advanced primavit resolves the entire preceding architecture.
It's powerful.
The listener is forced to hold all those complex hierarchical relationships in suspension. You have to wait for the final command to understand the full picture. The best way to visualize this is to think of a drawn bow.
Oh, I like that.
You pull back the string, adding more and more tension with every dependent clause, every ablative absolute, every participle.
Pulling it tighter?
The tension mounts, the muscles strain, and you do not release the arrow until the final syllable of the sentence.
It is exactly like holding your breath.
It really is.
And we have to stop and think about the psychological implications of this.
Definitely.
If you grow up speaking and thinking in a language that operates like a drawn bow, a language that requires you to constantly suspend resolution, it absolutely has to change how your mind processes reality.
Oh, without doubt.
Let's look at the verb system itself. Latin compresses so much complex thought into tiny bursts of grammatical engineering.
It's incredibly dense.
Take the most famous Latin phrase in history, Caesar's veni, vidi vici.
Right.
I came, I saw, I conquered. In English, that's 6 words. In Latin, it's 3. A single word like veni means I came. It implies the subject I, without even needing a separate pronoun.
The Latin verb is essentially a compressed zip file of information.
A zip file, yes.
A single verb contains the person, I, you, they, the number singular or plural,
Okay.
the tense when it happened, the voice active or passive, and the mood, is it a fact, a command, or a hypothetical?
All in one word.
One single word in Latin might require a 6-word phrase in English to translate, like they might have been about to carry.
So if you are thinking in Latin, you
Okay.
are cognitively rewarded for delayed clarity.
Exactly.
You are rewarded for patience. You have to mentally assemble the entire architecture of your thought before you even open your mouth to speak.
It takes planning.
It heavily favors strategic, long-term thinking over impulsive blurting. You cannot just start a sentence and hope you figure out where it's going halfway through.
Which, let's be honest, is how most of us speak English today.
Totally. In Latin, you have to know exactly where the roof is going to sit before you lay the foundational stones.
Exactly. The sentence is not a spontaneous burst of emotion. It is a premeditated formation. It trains the human mind to pay forensic attention to relationship, role, and rank.
Right.
Everything has its proper place.
That Val archetype again.
Right. And this provides us with a seamless transition into how this structural hierarchical mindset bleeds out of the grammar and into the culture itself.
The vocabulary.
If a language is built like a Roman, legion-organized, disciplined, hierarchical, it is naturally going to produce an incredibly specific, nuanced vocabulary for human behavior.
And this is where the deep dive gets really profound.
I agree.
Because we are going to look at some cultural keywords. These are words from our source text that simply do not have a clean one-to-one translation in English.
Right.
Why? Because the Roman social reality, the world governed by this vowel subpersonality, was fundamentally completely different from our modern individualistic world.
Yes.
You cannot understand the Roman mind without understanding the exact weight of these words.
Let us start with perhaps the most misunderstood Roman concept of all, virtus.
Oh, this is a massive one. Because an English speaker sees the letters V-I-R-T-U-S, and they immediately think virtue.
Exactly.
They think of being a good person, being kind, maybe turning the other cheek.
And that translation is a complete historical distortion.
Really?
Translating virtus as virtue in the modern, often Christianized sense of moral purity, gentleness, or passive goodness completely strips the word of its Roman soul.
So what did it mean to them?
The root of the word virtus is vir, which simply means man. Virtus is fundamentally martial.
Oh, wow.
It is manly strength, physical courage, and sheer force of character.
It's the kind of virtue that wins wars.
Exactly. It is excellence and worth, but specifically it is worth that must be proven in action.
You can't just think it.
You cannot have virtus by sitting quietly in a room having good thoughts. You demonstrate virtus by standing your ground in a shield wall while screaming Gauls charge at you.
Right.
Or by enduring immense physical pain without flinching, or by aggressively destroying your political opponent in a public trial.
It is not passive goodness at all.
No, it is aggressive, dominating excellence.
So if virtus is about aggressive excellence, what about the concepts of gravitas and dignitas?
Yeah.
Because if you read any Roman history, these 2 words seem to dictate every single decision a Roman aristocrat ever made.
They are the twin pillars of Roman public identity. Let's look at gravitas first.
Okay.
We use the word gravitas today to describe someone who acts serious.
Like a news anchor?
Right. But in Latin, gravitas literally translates to weight.
Like physical weight.
Yes. It is a physical metaphor for a moral reality. It is a moral heaviness. A Roman with gravitas does not merely act serious. They possess an intrinsic, unshakable authority and dignity.
Wow.
They command absolute respect without ever having to raise their voice or demand it. It is the overwhelming weight of their character pressing down on the room.
It's the opposite of being flighty or like easily emotionally swayed.
Exact.
And how does that relate to dignitas?
Dignitas is your accumulated public honor. It is your social standing, your prestige, your absolute worth in the eyes of the Republic. But here's the catch. Dignitas is not an inherent human right.
You're not born with it.
You are not born with it simply by existing. It is earned.
How?
It is accumulated through your public conduct, the magistracies you hold, your military victories, and critically, the historical achievements of your ancestors.
And to really understand how powerful this concept was, we have to look at how it drove historical events.
Like what?
We need to talk about Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon.
Oh, the perfect example.
Because modern people often misunderstand why he plunged the Roman Republic into a catastrophic civil war.
We project our modern ideas onto it.
Exactly. We view it through a modern lens. We think he was just a megalomaniac hungry for absolute dictatorial power.
Right.
But if you read Caesar's own writings, if you read what he told his soldiers, he doesn't say, let's go conquer Rome. He explicitly states that his political enemies in the Senate were trying to strip him of his dignitas.
That is the perfect historical anchor for this concept. For Caesar, to be stripped of his dignitas, to be humiliated publicly, to have his achievements invalidated, to be reduced to the status of an ordinary citizen after conquering Gaul, was a fate literally worse than death.
Wow. Worse than death.
It was social annihilation. Plunging the known world into years of bloody civil war was considered a perfectly rational response to protect his dignitas.
That is wild.
Roman politics was not a debate society. It was a blood sport played to protect and increase this specific social capital. If you insulted a Roman senator's dignitas, you were not hurting his feelings. You were threatening his existence.
Which brings us to another word that we have totally defanged in the modern era. Pietas.
Ah, yes.
We hear that and we think piety. We picture someone quietly devout, saying their prayers in private,
Yeah.
maybe giving to charity. A very internal, personal, religious feeling.
And again, the modern translation completely misses the Roman mechanism.
How so?
For the Romans, pietas was not an internal emotion. It was a strict, binding, relational duty. It was an unbreakable obligation to three specific entities: the gods of the state, the homeland Rome itself, and your family, particularly your father and your ancestors.
The ultimate mythological example of this from the text is Aeneas, right? The legendary founder of the Roman race.
Yes.
When the city of Troy is burning to the ground around him, his act of pietas isn't to sit and pray.
No.
His act of pietas is to physically carry his elderly father on his back, hold his son by the hand, and carry the household gods out of the flames to found a new city. It's duty in action.
Exactly. Duty held with profound reverence. If you were a Roman soldier, holding the line in battle wasn't just a matter of military discipline.
Right.
It was a supreme act of pietas to the Republic. You were fulfilling your sacred obligation.
And speaking of obligations to the past, there is a phrase that functions as the absolute core operating system of Roman law and morality. Mos maiorum.
The custom of the ancestors.
This one is huge.
This concept is perhaps the hardest for modern people to truly grasp.
Why do you say that?
Well, in modern Western culture, we are obsessed with innovation.
Oh, completely.
We worship the new. We talk about disruption as a positive good. We inherently believe that the future will be better and smarter than the past.
Yeah, progress.
The Romans believed the exact, precise opposite.
Right. For a Roman, if an idea is new, it is almost by definition suspicious and probably dangerous.
Exactly. For a Roman, all moral authority, all legal precedent, all political legitimacy flowed backward in time from mos maiorum.
So you look to the past for answers.
You didn't enact a policy because it was a novel, efficient, modern idea. You did it because that is how the ancestors did it.
Wow.
Precedent was God. The inherited ways of the founders were the only legitimate ways to govern. To break with mos maiorum, to introduce novelty, was to invite the wrath of the gods and the destruction of the state.
That is an incredibly heavy psychological burden to carry.
It really is.
Your entire life is just trying to live up to the ghosts
Yes.
of your grandfathers. And it made me realize something about another contrast in the Latin vocabulary, the difference between otium and negotium.
Oh, this is a great point.
Otium roughly translates to leisure or free time, and negotium, which is literally negotium, the negation of leisure, means business or public affairs.
Right.
But what struck me in the text is that even their downtime, their otium, wasn't really relaxing.
No, it was not. There was no concept of just checking out.
Right. It wasn't slouching on the couch, watching Netflix, or having a hobby.
No.
Roman otium was highly cultivated withdrawal. It was time specifically designated for reading Greek philosophy, for writing letters to shape your public legacy, for studying law, for refining your intellect so you could be more effective when you returned to negotium.
It was always purposeful.
It was socially meaningful leisure. Think about how utterly exhausting it must have been to live in a culture that was so relentlessly obsessed with the public panopticon.
The pressure was constant. Every move was watched.
Today, our culture prizes the idea of authentic self-expression. We want people to just be themselves, to let their guard down.
Yeah.
The Romans did not care about your authentic inner self.
And they absolutely didn't care about that.
They cared about whether you performed your duty, upheld your dignitas, and obeyed the mos maiorum.
It was a society of intense, unyielding external pressure. But here, we must be very careful not to turn the Romans into caricatures.
What do you mean?
While this highly structured lifestyle, this constant policing of behavior seems incredibly rigid and cold to us, the Romans were not unfeeling robots.
Right, they were human.
They were human beings. They felt deep, overwhelming emotions. Grief, lust, rage, joy, terror, just as intensely as we do.
Sure.
They simply processed those chaotic emotions through a very different, heavily armored cultural filter.
Yes, and that brings us to one of the most compelling insights from the source about the vowel archetype. There is this quote regarding Latin that summarizes the entire paradox.
Yeah.
The real inner world of Latin is not emotionless. It is emotion forced to stand in armor.
Emotion and armor.
Let's look at how that armor manifested in the creative and daily life of Rome, like their music, their food, and their humor.
Let us begin with their music and poetry, because it perfectly illustrates this armor.
Okay.
The rhythm of Latin poetry is fundamentally different from English poetry. English relies on stress accents.
Right.
Think of Shakespeare's iambic pentameter. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. We hit certain syllables harder and louder.
Very beat-driven.
Classical Latin poetry, however, relies on quantitative meter. Specifically, the meter of epic poetry used in Virgil's Aeneid is called dactylic hexameter.
This is a concept that English speakers really struggle to hear in their heads.
It is difficult, yes.
So if I'm understanding quantitative meter correctly from the text, it is less about a drumbeat of hitting a syllable hard and more like holding musical notes for different durations, like holding a whole note versus a half note in sheet music.
That is an excellent way to describe it. In Latin, rhythm is determined by how long it takes to physically articulate the syllable.
Okay.
Syllables are literally categorized as long or short, based on the vowels and consonant clusters. A dactyl is one long syllable followed by two short ones. A spondee is two long syllables.
Right.
So dactylic hexameter creates this rolling, highly regulated, very precise cadence. It sounds roughly like da 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 da.
Sounds like a military march.
It does. It does not rush. It does not skip. It advances with a ceremonial, almost unstoppable, heavily armored force.
Wow.
It makes the poetry sound incredibly stately, processional, and incantatory. It is not the loose, emotional, confessional vibe of a modern poet pouring their heart out.
Definitely not.
It is language engineered to be delivered in a massive, columned acoustic space. It is the rhythm of fate, of destiny, of duty.
And centuries later, this exact phonetic quality, the clear consonants, the open resonant vowels made Latin, the absolute perfect vehicle for Gregorian chants in the church.
Yes, exactly.
It sounds elevated above the chaos of normal human speech.
It does.
So even their art sounds like architecture. Even their poetry wears armor. I love that. But what about their daily life?
Let's look at it.
What about something as basic, biological, and necessary as food? Because the text shows the Latin vocabulary surrounding food reveals a massive, almost hypocritical tension in the Roman psyche.
It reveals the tension between their idealized past and their imperial present.
Unpack that for us.
Look at the core vocabulary of Roman agriculture. Panis, which is bread, vinum, wine, oleum, olive oil, and garum, the pungent fermented fish sauce they used on almost everything.
The culinary foundation of the Mediterranean.
Yes. And on one hand, you have the foundational myth of the Roman moral ideal, the farmer-soldier.
Right.
The story of Cincinnatus is the perfect example.
Remind me of that one.
He is plowing his modest field. The Senate calls upon him to be dictator and save Rome from an invading army. He puts down the plow, takes up the sword, destroys the enemy, resigns his absolute power after 15 days, and goes right back to plowing his field.
The ultimate Roman hero.
The Romans obsessed over this myth. Agriculture, plain food, and hard work were seen as the root of all moral virtue, simplicity and discipline.
Right, the poets are constantly praising the plain bread, the humble turnip, the virtuous sweat of the brow. But, well, that was a myth. What was the reality of the empire at its height?
The reality was that as the empire expanded, unfathomable wealth poured into Rome from Egypt, Greece, and the East.
Yeah.
So you end up with this bizarre, staggering paradox. The language constantly praises rustic, simple virtue, while simultaneously cataloging the most extravagant, decadent, absurdly luxurious banquets ever recorded in human history.
It's wild.
You have emperors like Elagabalus or fictional characters like Trimalchio hosting feasts where they're eating imported flamingo tongues,
Flamingo tongues.
parrot heads, dormice stuffed with pork and rolled in honey.
It's the ultimate hypocrisy. They were importing exotic animals from across the known world just to eat them as a status symbol, while their philosophers are writing about how noble it is to eat cabbage from a wooden bowl. The tension between the discipline of Val and the decadence of imperial reality is immense. And where you really see this tension explode, where the armor cracks just a bit, is in Roman humor.
Oh, Roman humor.
Let's talk about it, because it wasn't just telling jokes. Humor was a weapon.
It was a highly calibrated weapon. Roman satire, practiced by brilliant, vicious writers like Juvenal and Martial, was not lighthearted.
Rome.
It was not gentle. It was biting, frequently obscene, brutally direct, and intensely status conscious.
But what were they actually making fun of? Because if everyone is so obsessed with dignitas, how do you make jokes without getting killed?
You make jokes by attacking those who fail to uphold the rules. Roman insults targeted very specific cultural anxieties. They mocked vanity, physical weakness, social climbing, cowardice, and sexual passivity.
So attacking their vertices.
Exactly. If a politician was perceived as corrupt, if a philosopher was seen as a hypocrite acting holier than thou, or if a Roman man was perceived as lacking in masculine self-control, the satirists would absolutely destroy them in print.
Just roast them.
They would write short, punchy epigrams that would spread across the city, publicly shaming the target.
This is so familiar. Looking at how this functioned, it's clear that Roman satire was an ancient form of aggressive social policing.
Yes.
To use a very modern analogy, it was a highly formalized literary cancel culture.
Oh, definitely.
Instead of just getting a laugh, the mockery was a weapon explicitly designed to enforce the rigid norms of dignitas and virtus. If you stepped out of line, if you showed weakness, if you violated the mos maiorum, the humor was there to humiliate you back into your proper disciplined role.
That is an incredibly astute comparison. Laughter was not just entertainment. It was a mechanism of control.
Wow.
Mockery enforced the boundaries of acceptable behavior in a society that relied entirely on public reputation. It policed the hierarchy.
So we've built up this incredible picture of Latin. It is the ultimate language of boundaries, of rules, of military hierarchy, of armor, and of public duty.
Right.
But if you have a language that is so heavily weighted towards structure and command, it begs a massive question. What was it missing?
A very good question.
If Latin is so perfect for building empires, what couldn't it do well? To answer that, we have to look at Latin's great historical rival and ultimately its partner, Greek.
This comparison from the source is profound because it highlights the limitations of the Val archetype.
Right.
If Latin is the language of empire, of law, and of institutional order, Greek is the language of ideas, of fluid inquiry, and of philosophy.
They complement each other.
They are the two foundational languages of Western thought, but they operate on completely different cognitive frequencies.
The text mentions the idea of the philosophical laboratory versus the structured republic. Let's start with the syntax. We talk about the Latin sentence as a military march, a drawn bow waiting for a command. How does Greek sentence logic differ from that?
Greek syntax is incredibly fluid and supple.
Right.
While Latin relies heavily on building heavy, hierarchical, nested clauses that lock together like stone blocks, Greek uses an abundance of what linguists call particles.
Particle.
These are very small, subtle, connecting words, often untranslatable with a single English word, that allow for delicate shifts in emphasis, tone, and nuance. They're like the salt and pepper of thought.
So if Latin is a march, Greek is more of an exploration.
Exactly. A Greek sentence is a journey of thought development. It allows the speaker to move from an initial idea to a subtle refinement of that idea to a hypothetical qualification and finally to a philosophical insight.
Like how Plato writes.
Yes, you can see this in Plato's dialogues, which wander, explore, and question. It is the perfect grammatical structure for a philosopher trying to define the exact abstract nature of the universe or the soul.
Beautiful.
Latin organizes the physical world into roles and responsibilities. Greek explores the abstract nature of reality itself.
And you see this divergence immediately when you contrast the cultural keywords of both languages.
Oh, completely.
We already spent time on Latin's heavy hitters. Virtus, martial excellence. Gravitas, moral weight. Pietas, loyal duty. They're entirely focused on action, order, and public life. But look at the Greek keywords. Logos, reason. Discourse, the divine ordering principle. Physis, the fundamental nature of things. Ethos, character, and custom. Psyche, the mind, the breath, the soul.
It's completely different.
The Greek vocabulary is an entire tool set designed for acquiring knowledge, observing nature, and understanding the human condition from the inside out.
It reveals a culture obsessed with inquiry. The foundational Greek thought asks, what is truth? What is the nature of reality?
Yeah.
The foundational Latin thought asks, what is lawful? What is proper? How do we organize this?
And there is a technological difference between the two that I had literally never considered before reading this.
Oh, the alphabet.
The divergence is visible in the very technology they used to write, the alphabet itself.
This is a massive cognitive leap in human history that we take completely for granted today.
Tell us about it.
The Greek alphabet introduced separate, dedicated letters for vowels.
Wait, there were no vowels before.
The earlier alphabets in the Mediterranean and Near East were primarily consonant-based abjads. The reader had to supply the vowel sounds based on context.
That sounds confusing.
It was. By inventing dedicated letters for vowels, the Greeks made their writing system infinitely more precise, highly musical, and capable of capturing immense emotional nuance.
Wow.
It allowed them to capture tonal accents and exact vowel length with incredible accuracy, which fueled their explosion of lyric poetry, tragic drama, and nuanced philosophy.
The vowels gave the language a soul on the page.
Yes.
And then contrast that with what the Romans did.
Yes.
The Romans adapted the Etruscan and Greek alphabets, but think about how they utilized it visually. Think about Roman monumental script.
Trajan's collar is the perfect example.
Yes, all capital letters,
Yeah.
no lowercase, originally no spaces between the words, carved deep into the marble and stone of public buildings.
Visually, it embodies unyielding, permanent authority.
Yeah.
It does not invite debate. It declares reality.
A Greek manuscript looks like a flowing river of ideas. A Roman inscription looks like a permanent decree from the gods.
That's a great way to put it.
And when you put all of this together, the syntax, the vocabulary, the visual script, it leads to this massive realization from the deep dive. Greek asked the questions, but Latin built the systems.
Exactly.
Greek explored the theoretical truth, but Latin organized the human society required to preserve that truth. The entire modern Western world, our legal systems, our scientific taxonomy, our political philosophies, is a direct inheritance of Greek intellectual curiosity, managed, codified, and distributed by Roman discipline.
It is the ultimate fusion. Greek invented the philosophical, scientific, and artistic forms. Latin perfected the bureaucratic and legal systems required to institutionalize them so they could survive for millennia.
But as we all know from history, the physical Roman Empire did not survive.
It did not.
The center could not hold. Rome fell, the legions retreated, and the centralized administration collapsed. But the Latin language did not die. It shattered.
Yeah.
It shattered into millions of pieces across the European continent. And the specific way it shattered tells an incredible, deeply human story about geography, politics, and power.
It really does.
To explore this, we are going to move to our final section, the dialect cloud, and the birth of the languages of the Iberian Peninsula. Spanish and Portuguese.
This is a vital conceptual clarification from our source text.
Okay.
When modern people think about how languages evolve, they almost always visualize a family tree.
Yeah, a trunk with branches.
Right. We imagine one single, perfectly uniform language, classical Latin, acting as a solid trunk, and then, at some specific date in history, a branch cleanly snaps off and becomes French. Another branch snaps off and becomes Spanish. Another branch becomes Portuguese.
We think of it as a clean, definitive break. One day they are speaking Latin, the next day they are speaking Spanish.
But the historical reality is completely different. During the centuries of Roman occupation of Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, there was no single, uniform Latin spoken by everyone. Instead, there was a vast continuum of regional, vulgar Latin varieties. It was a dialect cloud.
A dialect cloud. I love that.
A farmer in the north sounded slightly different from a merchant in the south, but they could generally understand each other. Over centuries, particularly after the collapse of Roman road networks and centralized communication, this cloud began to drift apart.
And it was heavily influenced by the physical geography of the peninsula.
Geography is destiny. We are talking about mountains and river valleys acting as natural walls, isolating people.
Precisely. If you look at the map of the Iberian Peninsula, it is highly mountainous.
Very rugged.
As the centralized Roman power faded, and later as the Visigoths and then the Moors invaded, communication across these mountains slowed to a crawl. Communities became isolated.
Right.
So in the northwest Atlantic zone, the rugged, rainy area that is now Galicia and northern Portugal, the language evolved in isolation. Because it was cut off, it actually preserved much older, more archaic Latin vowel systems.
It held on to the past.
Meanwhile, right in the center of the peninsula, on the high, dry inland plateau, a very different, more innovative version emerged. This became Castilian, the direct ancestor of modern Spanish.
The physical geographic split literally forced the dialects to mutate in different directions.
And there's one linguistic detail here that I think is the most beautiful insight of this entire deep dive. It's the concept of the missing middle. I'm talking about the Galician language. Because historically, in the Middle Ages, Galician and Portuguese were essentially the exact same language. Galician Portuguese, they shared a rich tradition of lyric poetry.
Right.
But then human politics intervened. Borders were drawn, Portugal became an independent kingdom, expanded south, and eventually became a massive global maritime empire. Galicia, however, remained politically absorbed inside the Kingdom of Spain.
A political border severed a linguistic continuum.
Exactly. So today, if you look at Galician, linguistically, it sits right in the middle. It is the living, breathing bridge between Spanish and Portuguese. It has elements of both.
It proves the watercolor blending theory of language evolution.
Yeah, languages didn't just snap apart like dry twigs. They bled into one another across the map, like watercolors on wet paper.
It is a beautiful linguistic artifact that survived the centuries. But we cannot talk about the linguistic landscape of the Iberian Peninsula without discussing the other massive transformative influence that shaped these languages: the Moorish conquest.
The Muslim rule of the peninsula, starting in 711 AD, they were there for 700 years.
7 centuries.
That kind of presence is going to leave a massive mark on the vocabulary.
A profound and permanent mark. Arabic was the prestige language of science, administration, and high culture in Al-Andalus for centuries.
Wow.
Spanish, in particular, absorbed a massive amount of Arabic vocabulary. Because Islamic culture at the time was highly advanced in mathematics, agriculture, and engineering, the Latin-speaking locals adopted the Arabic words for these new technologies and concepts.
Give us some examples.
We see it in words like azúcar sugar, acetic oil, algodón cotton, and alcázar castle or fortress.
You can almost always spot them because they start with a or al, which is often the Arabic definite article fused onto the noun.
Exactly. Now, Portuguese also borrowed heavily from Arabic, but because of the specific geography and timeline of the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest moving South Spanish absorbed significantly more of this vocabulary into its core administrative language.
Okay.
On the other hand, Portuguese maintained older, more complex Romance phonetic traits that Castilian Spanish eventually simplified or lost entirely.
Can you give an example of that phonetic difference? Because it really changes how the languages sound to the ear today.
The most obvious and famous difference is the complex nasal vowels in Portuguese.
Right.
When you say the word for hand in Portuguese, it is mão, with a deep nasal resonance. Bread is pão.
Yeah, it has that buzz to it.
Exactly.
Huh.
Castilian Spanish simplified those older phonetic clusters and lost most of those deep nasal qualities. So the Spanish word for hand is mano, and bread is pan. It is clearer, more sharply defined phonetically.
Which leads to a really fascinating, almost psychological speculation from the source about the emotional personality of these two languages today.
Yeah.
Because of these distinct evolutionary paths, the geographic isolation, the different phonetic simplification, the varying Arabic influence, they fundamentally feel different to speak and to hear.
They really do.
Spanish, with its clearer, simplified vowel structures and sharp consonants, often feels brighter. It feels punchier, highly percussive, and rhetorically direct.
While Portuguese, with its richer vowel blending, its diphthongs, and that deep nasalization, often feels softer to the ear.
Yeah, it does.
It feels emotionally shaded, perhaps slightly more inward, melancholic, or reflective. The phonology, the actual physical shape of the sound waves produced by the mouth, subtly shapes the aesthetic tone of the culture.
But the ultimate lesson here, the final, sobering takeaway about Spanish and Portuguese, is a reminder of exactly how we started this entire conversation about Latin.
Bring it back around.
Why did Castilian Spanish and Portuguese become massive, global languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people across Latin America, Africa, and Europe, while a beautiful language like Galician remained a regional tongue spoken by a few million?
Good question.
It was not because Spanish and Portuguese had better grammar. It was not because their vowels sounded prettier.
No, it had absolutely nothing to do with linguistic superiority. It was entirely about state building. It was about raw political and military power. Castile managed to conquer most of the Iberian Peninsula, centralize the administration, and enforce its dialect.
The power of the state.
Yes. Portugal maintained its independence, built a massive fleet, and became a global maritime empire, colonizing Brazil, parts of Africa, and outposts in Asia. The modern linguistic map of the world is simply a map of military expansion, naval power, and empire.
Spanish and Portuguese spread globally in the 16th century for the exact same reason Latin spread across Europe 2,000 years earlier.
Exactly.
They were the language of the people who controlled the state, who built the ships, and who carried the weapons. It is a perfect, somewhat brutal historical rhyme.
It really is. The fundamental mechanisms of linguistic dominance rarely change. The language of power becomes the language of the people.
Which brings us to the end of this truly monumental journey. We have traveled from the muddy agrarian fields of early Latium, where farmers spoke a rough, tribal dialect.
Yeah.
We've seen that dialect engineered into the massive, tension-filled, drawn-bow sentences of Cicero's Senate. We've explored the cultural armor of the Roman mind, the martial virtus, the heavy gravitas, the unyielding mos maiorum.
The whole operating system.
We've contrasted the institutional system building of Rome with the philosophical inquiry of Greece. And finally, we watched that Roman operating system shatter, influenced by geography and Arabic conquest, into a dialect cloud across the mountains of Spain and Portugal, only to rise again as global empires.
It is a powerful reminder that we should stop calling Latin a dead language.
Absolutely.
Latin is not dead, it's simply evolved. More importantly, the conceptual framework of Latin, that vowel archetype of discipline and structure, is the linguistic skeleton of modern Western institutions.
It's everywhere.
Every single time a lawyer files a subpoena, every time a biologist classifies a new species, every time politicians debate the future of our republic, we are literally running the ancient Roman operating system in our modern minds.
Wow.
The vocabulary of authority is still Roman.
The code is still executing, 2,000 years later. Before we wrap up, give us a final thought to take away from this deep dive into the language of discipline and law.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, thinking about Latin is about recognizing that a functioning world requires organization. It requires structure. In a modern culture that is obsessed with the new, with disruption, with the impulsive, and with authentic self-expression, Latin stands as a stark monument to the opposite worldview. It reminds us that true legacy, the things that survive the collapse of empires and last for millennia, outlives impulsive emotion. Discipline gives form to power. That is the enduring, unyielding lesson of Latin.
Discipline gives form to power. That is a heavy, monumental thought. Thank you for walking through this massive architecture with me.
My pleasure.
And to you, the listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Okay.
We've spent this time establishing that Latin became the foundational operating system of the West because it was inextricably tied to the infrastructure of power. The roads, the laws, the military logistics, the administration.
Right.
So what is the Latin of today?
Oh, that's interesting.
In 1,000 years, will future historians look back at computer programming languages, Python, C++, Java, the code that builds our modern digital roads, our algorithmic laws, and our invisible globe-spanning empires, and analyze them the exact same way we just analyzed Latin?
Wow.
Will they look at the strict syntax of our code and see our cultural values hidden within it? Are we building the new stone columns right now, the server farms of the world, without even realizing it? Keep questioning the structures and the syntax around you. We'll see you on the next deep dive.